So now we're back in FL Studio, and I have unlocked with my license, so I have my name here, and everything is full and ready to go. Got it unlocked in here, all that sort of deal. Put in my email address from before, and we got our audio settings where they need to be. I downloaded that Focusrite driver from their website. Just put in the information there, and if you're not using Focusrite, you can get the driver if you even need one. Of course, depending on whatever audio interface or operating system you are using. And then you'll be able to go in and set whatever buffer sort of stuff you have and do that however you expect for whatever your device happens to be. I am going to stick with the FL Studio ASIO for now though, so we can actually hear everything for video recording purposes. But at any rate, that's all good to go. So, to start out actually looking at everything in here, we're going to get a feel for just kind of the interface and how we can work and where things are, what things are from a broad standpoint. And we'll kind of hop around, jump to a few different places, and just kind of see an overview kind of. So when we come back, we have a little bit of familiarity, and we have also just a good idea of how everything works and what buttons to press and how to interface with FL Studio. And as far as interfacing goes, most things are pretty simple. If you see a knob, you can turn it, click and drag, reset it, or if you want to hold Alt and left click, and then you'll reset back to the default value, or right clicking and hitting R or resetting. We'll do the same. You'll note that when you have a drop down come up like this, some letters are underlined. Those are the ones that if you press that on your keyboard, you'll automatically hit that option in the list. So if I wanted to copy and I want to do that quickly, I could right click on something, hit C, and then I copied that value, and then I could right click somewhere else and hit P because those are the highlighted letters of those terms. So it's quick and easy to copy and paste values between whatever different parameters you may be working with if you want to do that. And you can do that to different places, different controls. Or of course, you can just do the quote-unquote old-fashioned way and right-click and choose the option in the drop-down how you would anywhere else. But we'll use the shortcut holding Alt to click all these and reset them back to their default values. Additionally, when you're moving parameters, if you want to move it a little bit more fine-tuned, you can hold Control down, and then the movement will be a little bit slower than if you don't have that down. So you can really fine-tune to a certain level. And speaking of, this is a good point to bring up the hint panel up top here. And this is a place you should be looking pretty often because it's definitely a lot of use. You'll note that anytime you hover over something, you have a readout of what that control is. And then if you're changing a value, you also have the exact percent or value that is written out. So that's very useful. And even if you don't necessarily know what you're turning, you can get that quick little bit of info to either refresh your memory or help you understand what you're working with. And I'll hit Control Z to undo that. And you can also do that in Edit Undo, same deal. And if you want to undo multiple levels of undoing, hold Control and Alt and then hit Z. And then you'll notice that in your history on the browser, that'll pop up. And you can undo a number of different changes or redo since you have all of these different layers of undoing or redoing. And over left here is the browser. There's a few things we can do in here. There are your samples, everything that you can find in there, packs. And we'll get more into this in the next videos, but that's what's over here. The channel rack here is where whatever sorts of instruments or channels of synthesizers, anything like that will be placed and worked with. So you'll spend a lot of time working in here. And each channel has its channel settings if you select it, which we'll see more once we get into more detail. But moving over to the playlist, that's what's over here. This is where you'll piece together different patterns that you make, which will be done in the channel rack. So you take your parts from the channel rack, work them into the playlist to build a song, basically. And there is a different approach than how you might think tracks will work, but we'll get into that. Same deal with the mixer. You'll notice right now that we have these 4 channels automatically routed to different tracks on the mixer. And there's all sorts of different things we can do on here for routing and also running different sorts of effects. But again, we'll get into more detail once we get to this specifically. There's also the piano roll if we want to work outside of just the channel rack. This is where you'll be able to program different things, change more detailed MIDI information. But again, a lot to unpack in there, so we'll wait until we get a little bit more detail. You'll note that eventually you kind of get a lot of windows going here, And what you can do is press F12 to clear that out, and that will close everything but the channel rack. Or if you have a number of different windows open and you want to close those, you can hold Alt and F12, and that will leave all these other windows as well and just close the settings for channels or effects and just anything that can pop up and clutter the area, except for the channel rack, playlist, and mixer. You'll note I clicked a few things here. These are how we open these different piano roll, channel rack, everything like that. We can select them and bring them up. The browser even, we can close that by clicking up here. The project picker and the plugin picker, plus just a few other tools, like we can tap the tempo at this, and that will automatically set that there, or you can set a tempo just by clicking and dragging, or right-clicking to set to a value. You'll also note that when you're on a control, tempo included, you can use the scroll wheel to nudge it up and down. And especially with the tempo, you can kind of work on each decimal and slide it up and down with that mouse wheel. And there are quite a few more details in the upper toolbar, and we can even customize this a bit in the area. If we right-click and hit Edit, we could drag in a few different sorts of buttons that we might want. Like if I wanted to just click and drag in some different controls, I could put these ones in and right-click again, turn off the editing, and then I could press that to hold control, or it'll also show if I'm holding control on my keyboard. And essentially, you're just customizing this toolbar, and we'll get back into that once we do a little bit more customization, but the idea is fairly simple, and for the time being, we will just leave it close to default. A few other key buttons that are worth knowing: if we middle-click on something, we can edit the name of it, and that goes for basically everything. Channels, tracks on the playlist if we want to do it that way. Inserts of the mixer, even though I didn't label that correctly. But pretty simple, and you can also right-click to change these sorts of things. There's also color that you can do. Pick from a wheel of color. And this being a wheel instead of just a selector is new to version 20.7. And with it, you can unlock the colors now to go from essentially any color, which is cool. But we'll just pick whatever, hit accept, and we'll actually call this a clap since that's what's on insert 2 at the moment. And now you'll see that we have a color there, and that same principle goes for anything that you're naming, middle clicking and changing all these display types for it. You can get the icon. It's a kick drum. Maybe we find a kick drum in here. And it also goes for patterns. So say we want to make a kick pattern, we can name that kick. We can put a few different kick triggers, and again, we'll get back into this later. Put that on your track. Go up here, add a new pattern. Make it a snare. Add in a snare. And there we have a few things for organization. And obviously, I'm moving pretty quickly. Don't worry too much at the moment. This is just kind of putting a few ideas out there since we are going to get into detail later. And even if you don't understand everything yet, you're definitely going to. And eventually you're just going to feel like a fish in water. But so far, all of this has just been mouse and keyboard control. We can also do touch controls for a number of different things. If we want to use MIDI, we can select something, have a touch controller pop up here. You can change the type that is. It can be keys, it could be pads, or whatever we may need at the moment. And if you're using a touch screen at that point, which I am not currently, you could basically have a MIDI keyboard on your screen, which is pretty cool. And also if you're using those touch controls in the mixer, you can enable some more multi-touch possibilities with this button here. And again, you'll look in the top left and you'll see that this is your multi-touch control. Enable or disable. Anytime you see that hand, you're pretty much dealing with a touch control. That's the icon for it. And this will be a matter of preference. I generally prefer to have mouse and keyboard for pretty much everything, but there are definitely benefits to having touch control. And even another way you can control, there are some different hardware opportunities to do so. You can check out the Akai Fire, which is built for FL Studio, so you can essentially just work with the channel rack on these buttons, which is pretty cool. So if you want to program in different things, change them just by pressing them on the pad interface, and I'm just going to hit spacebar to play, or I could press play on the Fire itself. I can change from pattern to song with it, channel rack being the pattern, and the playlist being the song. But again, this is stuff that you can just do by clicking or touching certain things. It's just a matter of which one you have, which one you want to use, and which one makes sense to you. My personal default, again, is just the mouse and keyboard almost all the time. I do have some of these additional things. The fire does come in handy for just being able to enable certain things. You can select different areas from the channel rack, mixer, with the fire, or use touch control to quickly touch wherever you want to be, but a lot of the time it just ends up being the mouse that I use anyway. So don't worry about any of these things being make or break to your workflow. So I know we kind of jumped all over the place here, but like I said, this is just sort of to get that initial idea of where everything is. Don't worry if we jumped a little bit too quickly to understand everything happening, because we will nail this information down once we get to more detail here as we jump specifically into these different parts. And you might note, again, this does all look a little bit more flexible than you might be used to if you're working in other DAWs. So it might feel a little bit strange to be able to do some of the things that we can do. But once we do have each of these parts fully understood, the whole is very strong and very flexible to be able to do a lot of different things. So now with a bit of feel for all this stuff, the interfacing, the workspace, we're going to continue moving on, starting with the channel rack in the next video. So I will see you then.